Exactly. Let's unpack this. We're diving deep into a subject that, well, it surrounds us every single day, yet we rarely give it the critical, almost existential attention it deserves.
Mm.
I'm talking about the architecture of the modern world. Think about the last contemporary cityscape you were in. All those gleaming glass towers, the standardized blocks, the way everything feels optimized.
Right.
Despite all the technological marvels that let us build higher and faster than ever, why does so much of it feel, well, fundamentally disconnected? Or, as our sources suggest, maybe even a little soulless?
Yeah.
We're launching a full-scale analysis of this trend, a period some really influential critics are starting to label the Glass Age.
And what's fascinating here, I think, is just the sheer scale of the shift we're talking about. We're trying to move beyond simple aesthetic judgment, whether you happen to prefer brick to glass.
Right, it's not just about taste.
Not at all. We're asking a much, much deeper question. How has architecture, in its zealous pursuit of efficiency and speed and transparency, how has it fundamentally lost its ability to nourish the human spirit?
That's a big question.
It is. We're exploring what happens when the design of our environments just forfeits its spiritual skin, its emotional resonance. So our mission today is to really analyze this profound historical break, trace the path from these ancient identity-forming spaces to today's transparent spectacle, and crucially, we're going to integrate the hard empirical evidence that's emerging from the field of neuroarchitecture.
So we're treating the built environment not just as something practical, shelter from the rain,
Right.
but as a crucial psychological agent, a key determinant of our well-being.
Precisely. The argument, which is so powerfully drawn from the documents we looked at, views the built environment not as some mere background, but as a vessel for the collective soul and for individual cognitive health.
A vessel. I like that.
And we need to understand the profound and, frankly, often damaging consequences that occur when that vessel is reduced to a purely functional machine, optimized only for, say, maximizing productivity metrics and capital.
Okay, so let's start with that moment. The historical rift, the revolutionary moment that initiated this whole split. Modern architecture, it wasn't an evolution, was it? It was a radical break.
Oh, a complete break.
Almost a declaration of ideological war against the past, and it seems to be strongly catalyzed by the Industrial Revolution.
It was a conscious and, in many ways, a violent severance. I mean, the Industrial Revolution created these new material capacities, mass-produced steel, huge plates of glass, reinforced concrete.
All the building blocks.
All the building blocks. And at the same time, it created unprecedented social problems, right? Rapid urbanization, the need for mass housing. So the modernists felt that the ornate, historically referential styles of the past were just irrelevant.
Dishonest, even.
Dishonest, exactly. Their core philosophy involved the deliberate abandonment of all the interpretive and intangible aspects, spiritual depth, cultural memory, emotional dimensions, all of it.
And they replaced those intangible elements with what? Just scientific rationalism.
Exactly. Scientific rationalism displaced spiritual depth. The goal was to create structures that were functionally perfect, universal, and easily reproducible. And this resulted in buildings that, well, often failed to relate meaningfully to humanity, or to a local place, or to history.
They were just machines.
They were meant to be replicable machines that could solve global problems.
The phrase I always hear when discussing this era is the machine aesthetic. It sounds clean, efficient, but also pretty cold.
That phrase perfectly encapsulates the shift. The machine aesthetic involved two key actions. First, reject all historical references and traditional ornamentation.
Get rid of it.
And second, embrace materials that were seen as honest and industrial concrete, glass, and steel. It was the architectural embodiment of the age of mass production.
And leading figures like Le Corbusier famously adopted the mantra, form follows function.
That was the defining statement of the era. I mean, Corbusier famously viewed buildings as machines for living.
Machines for living.
The idea was that the purpose of the building, its function, should dictate its design, stripping away everything that was seen as superfluous. And to be fair, the early goals of modernism, especially through movements like the Bauhaus, were noble. They wanted to create accessible, clean, light-filled spaces for the masses.
Wait, I have to challenge that for a moment. We can't simply dismiss the entirety of modernism as a failure, can we?
No, of course not.
I mean, hasn't this focus on efficiency and hygiene given us massive positive advancements? Affordable mass housing, standardized components that lowered costs, and hospitals that are demonstrably cleaner and more functional than older, darker structures.
That is a crucial point, and it reflects the complexity of the source material. You're absolutely right. Modernism delivered precisely what it promised in terms of utility and sanitation.
It solved real problems.
It solved very real problems of overcrowding and disease through light, air, and standardized, easily cleaned surfaces. But the critique isn't about utility failure, it's about existential failure.
Ah.
The reductionist approach meant prioritizing practicality to the exclusion of everything else, especially beauty, which was seen as just superfluous.
So the functionality was achieved, but that deeper human connection was just lost in translation.
Precisely. The buildings became practical structures,
Yep.
perfectly aligned with metric spreadsheets, but they lacked the ability to evoke deep feeling or communicate cultural memory or inspire. They became uninspiring precisely because they only served a tangible purpose. The soul, as the source material argues, was evacuated in the pursuit of absolute utility.
This philosophical trajectory brings us directly to one of the most famous declarations of the era, the war on ornamentation. Why did they hate decoration so much?
It was ideological,
Mm.
purely ideological. For leading modernists, ornamentation wasn't just old-fashioned, it was seen as morally corrupt.
Wow, a morally
Yeah.
corrupt.
Yeah. You have to think of the Austrian architect Adolf Loos's searing 1908 essay, Ornament and Crime. He argued that ornamentation was a waste of labor, a symbol of societal stagnation and bourgeois excess.
So it was a class thing, too.
Absolutely. This philosophical stance held that stripping away decoration purified the architecture and made it more ethical and honest by exposing the structure itself.
To contemporary ears, that just sounds so extreme. But why was ornamentation historically so critical before this time?
It was so much more than decorative fluff. It was information storage. Before modernism, ornamentation served this crucial function. It encoded cultural memory. It communicated historical continuity.
So the building was telling you a
The
story.
building spoke a language the public understood. In classical architecture, every capital, every frieze, every molding told a story of mythology, of civic virtue, of religious belief. When you remove that, you flatten architecture into abstraction.
It becomes mute.
It becomes mute, exactly. When you remove that layer of complexity in cultural communication, the building struggles to tell a story or connect with the viewer on any deeper emotional level.
And when this new machine aesthetic became the global standard, stripping things down, focusing on these efficient boxes of concrete and glass, the consequence was just rapid homogeneity.
Absolutely. The machine ethic, designed for mass production and global scalability, it naturally led to a pervasive lack of distinguishing features across diverse structures. The goal of optimized grids and standardized construction meant that cities worldwide, whether you're in Chicago, Tokyo, or Moscow, began to fill with similar layouts and identical materials.
Which gives us that distinct feeling of placelessness.
Exactly that. The consequence, as we see everywhere, from vast suburban housing blocks to generic corporate parks, is the creation of monotonous environments that fail to establish a unique local identity.
The environment starts to feel interchangeable.
And when the environment is interchangeable, the people within it start to feel interchangeable too. This placelessness contributes directly to the alienation we feel when we look at these vast repeating structures.
So we have the philosophical groundwork laid, the rejection of history, the embrace of utility, but the specific material that defines our present moment, this glass age, is glass itself.
Right.
It's moved from being an accent material to the default cladding of our civilization, defining the look of corporate power globally.
And this transition, it marks a major symbolic shift that really requires contrast. We need to remember the traditional use of glass. Think about the age of cathedrals.
Stained glass.
Stained glass, exactly. It was a sacred membrane. It wasn't about maximizing light penetration. It was about filtering it. It transformed harsh exterior light into these chromatic, transcendent firmaments, mediating between the earthly and the divine. The glass was an object of awe, a means to elevate the spirit.
It was a medium for a spiritual experience. Today, it seems to be used for something entirely different. Transparency for the sake of showing off.
Today, glass is just ubiquitous. It symbolizes not sacred openness, but optimization, speed, and spectacle. It promises transparency while often concealing tremendous amounts of environmental control machinery and, well, often the cold logic of finance behind its polished, reflective surfaces.
And what are some of the practical criticisms of this reliance on glass beyond the aesthetic? Because I know critics argue it often prioritizes spectacle over true utility.
And that's where the machine metaphor often breaks down. Glass curtain walls, while they might look beautiful in spectacle architecture, are notoriously difficult to climate control.
Oh, right, the greenhouse effect.
They create extreme solar gain, turning interiors into greenhouses, which then requires massive energy expenditure for air conditioning, completely negating any supposed efficiency gains. Moreover, glass surfaces are deadly to bird populations.
I've heard about this.
They essentially transform our cityscapes into enormous, invisible traps. The material, in its absolute domination, is often a triumph of image over ecological and physical practicality.
And the dominance of the glass curtain wall has led to what you call a critical loss, the death of the architectural threshold.
This is perhaps the most spiritually damaging aspect of the Glass Age. The threshold is that architectural boundary that separates inside from outside, public from private, the secular from the sanctified.
It's more than just a door, though.
Oh, much more. Historically, the threshold served as a site of psychological transformation. It was a portal, a pause, a breath. Think of the deep entryway of a classical building or the narthex of a church. You transition slowly.
You're preparing yourself.
Yes. This mediation between realms, going from the chaotic, profane outside street into the ordered, sacred, or private interior, is essential for mental focus and a sense of sanctuary. And modern curtain walls are criticized for erasing this boundary entirely.
They just dissolve it.
They dissolve the sense of transition and hierarchy, which the critique argues leads directly to emotional flatness and a disconnection from a sense of sanctuary. It makes the interior feel perpetually exposed in public.
If the motivation isn't spiritual, then it must be economic. It seems this glass-dominated environment is just inextricably linked to capital and spectacle.
That is the essential insight of the critique. The contemporary fully glazed skyscraper is often described as resembling a spreadsheet in vertical form.
A spreadsheet in vertical form, I like that.
Every aspect of its design, from the spacing of the floor plates to the maximized window ratios, prioritizes efficiency metrics and profit maximization over human proportion or public engagement. The sheer reflectivity and height are meant to signal dominance and financial strength.
This sounds like architecture serving corporate ego rather than the public good.
Exactly. This phenomenon is closely linked to what is termed checkbook architecture, where high-profile, globally recognizable buildings are commissioned primarily for corporate branding or executive vanity, or just as a physical, unmistakable show of financial power on the global stage.
So the building becomes a giant, expensive advertisement for the company's power.
And the consequence for the individual is profound alienation. When the urban landscape is built primarily to serve the system, to reflect capital and corporate power, and not the soul, the architecture becomes abstracted and alienating. The city turns into a hall of mirrors, reflecting only itself, rather than reflecting the culture, the history, or the communal values of its human inhabitants.
The architecture signals that the purpose of life within that structure is purely transactional.
Exactly. Now, we can transition from that philosophical critique to hard science. This is where the emerging field of neuroarchitecture steps in, and it moves the argument entirely out of subjective taste.
Okay.
It provides verifiable empirical evidence linking specific elements of the built environment directly to our mental health, our behaviors, and our deep emotional states.
So this is where we confirm that design isn't just a background, it's an active ingredient in our cognitive health.
That's the inescapable reality. The average person spends about, 80% of their time indoors within constructed environments. Working, sleeping, living. This makes the design elements light, color, scale, acoustics absolutely critical, not just for comfort, but for our measurable psychological and physiological well-being.
So neuroarchitecture is the proof.
It integrates neuroscience, environmental psychology, and cognitive science to provide empirical data on how architectural spaces affect the human brain, with the ultimate goal of enhancing well-being and potentially alleviating symptoms of common mental disorders like depression and anxiety.
That immediately makes me think about my own workspace. If I'm sitting under harsh fluorescent lights all day, that's not a neutral experience. Let's break down some of those specific elements. Starting with lighting, what is the empirical impact?
Lighting is arguably the most powerful environmental determinant of our mood and health. Natural light plays a crucial role in regulating our circadian rhythms.
Our sleep-wake cycle.
Exactly, our 24-hour internal clock. And proper regulation improves sleep quality and has been consistently shown to reduce symptoms of depression. Furthermore, natural light stimulates the production of serotonin.
The happy chemical.
The happy neurotransmitter, yeah. It directly contributes to feelings of well-being.
And the reverse must also be true.
Absolutely. Environments with poor quality or insufficient lighting, especially that flickering artificial kind, tend to cause heightened stress, increased eye strain, and general tiredness. It just negatively affects your mental activity and energy levels.
So the large windows of modernism were actually a good thing then.
The prioritization of large windows and daylight access is one of modernism's true successes, but only when integrated carefully. You have to avoid the glare and the heat issues that too much untreated glass creates.
Right. What about the physical scale? It seems intuitive that a cramped room feels different than a high-ceiling hall, but does the height of a ceiling truly change how we think?
Research suggests it significantly influences cognition, yes.
Daily.
Studies have found that higher ceilings rooms, generally above 10 feet, tend to promote abstract thought, creativity, and a sense of freedom or expansiveness.
So it literally opens your mind.
It might be linked to a psychological perception of less constraint. Conversely, lower ceilings tend to encourage focus, detail-oriented tasks, and containment. The application here is enormous. You want brainstorming sessions in high-ceiling spaces and deep, detail-oriented work in more contained areas.
That's fascinating. It shows that spatial arrangement is not random, it directs our cognitive process.
Precisely.
Color psychology is often seen as a soft science, but what's the solid evidence of its impact within the built environment?
Well, colors are powerful nonverbal cues that influence emotional states directly. Warm shades, reds, oranges, and yellows stimulate energy, warmth, and excitement, making them appropriate for high-activity social spaces.
And cool shades do the opposite.
Exactly. Cool shades, blues, greens, and soft purples are known to evoke calm, tranquility, and introspection. This is critical in sensitive environments. Hospitals and clinical care centers, for instance, they use soft neutrals and cool greens strategically to minimize patient distress and create a sense of calmness.
And acoustics seem absolutely vital, especially in our densely populated, often loud, urban environments.
Adverse acoustics are a massive source of chronic stress and cognitive drain. That constant buzz, the inability to focus due to competing sounds, this feeling is particularly acute in poorly managed open-plan offices, schools, and hospitals.
It raises your stress hormones.
It increases cortisol levels, the body's primary stress hormone.
So acoustic design is basically preventative healthcare.
Exactly. Good acoustic design isn't a luxury, it's a necessity for health. It utilizes sound-absorbing materials like thick carpets, specialized acoustic panels, strategic barriers, all to create harmonious, quiet spaces necessary for sustained concentration.
Which you just don't get in a giant reverberant glass lobby.
Right. The chronic lack of sufficient sound management leads to palpable discomfort and lowered concentration for users.
Let's move to biophilic design. Is this just about putting plants in the lobby, or is there a deeper evolutionary rationale?
The rationale is deeply evolutionary. Biophilia, or the innate human connection to nature, is rooted in the recognition that our brains evolved in natural, not concrete, settings.
We're wired for nature.
We are. And it goes far beyond just adding potted plants. True biophilic design involves integrating nature through sensory cues. Filtered natural light, views of natural systems, and especially the use of patterns found in nature, like fractal geometry.
Fractal geometry, that sounds technical.
It is, but it's critical. Fractal patterns are those repeating, self-similar structures you see everywhere, in tree branches, coastlines, snowflakes. Our brains are hardwired to process these efficiently.
So seeing them is calming.
Studies show that exposure to biophilic elements, even simple views of trees or the use of wood and stone textures with complex grain patterns, has been empirically shown to lower blood pressure, reduce cortisol stress levels, and improve cognitive function. It's essentially healing the mind by placing it in an environment it recognizes as safe and supportive.
Beyond individual rooms, what happens when we zoom out to the entire urban environment? What is the psychological cost of all this placelessness and monotony?
The collective cost is enormous. When entire neighborhoods are filled with monotonous or placeless environments, identical housing blocks, generic strip malls, identical glass office towers, it fundamentally erodes personal and collective identity. It contributes significantly to widespread feelings of alienation and lack of belonging.
And structurally, good design aids in something called cognitive mapping. What does that mean for the average person navigating their day?
Cognitive mapping is our brain's process of creating mental maps. Good urban and architectural design supports legibility.
Legibility. So it's easy to read the city.
Exactly. It means the environment is clear and understandable. It offers clear paths, recognizable unique landmarks, and strong spatial cues. This is crucial for memory, orientation, and reducing anxiety. When spaces are disorienting or lack unique landmarks like a vast, repeating set of suburban streets, it increases cognitive load and anxiety because the brain constantly struggles to orient itself.
We feel secure when we know where we are.
And placeless architecture actively undermines that security.
It sounds like modernism, in its zeal for efficiency, just threw out the blueprints for how to inspire the human mind. If they prioritize utility, let's look at what we lost. The traditional architecture that prioritized storytelling, identity, and inspiration that often carried a sacred aura.
Absolutely. For the vast majority of human history, architecture wasn't simply about enclosing space. It was an act of profound cultural storytelling, an attempt to embody human ideals and inspire ambition.
Religious architecture, as you mentioned, is the clearest example of this.
It is the ultimate expression of architecture designed to serve the soul. Spaces like great cathedrals use light, acoustics, and monumental-scale lofty arches, intricate stained glass, long reverberation times to evoke awe, reverence, introspection, and a palpable connection to something larger than the individual.
And this wasn't accidental.
Not at all. It was engineered reverence.
And the materials themselves contributed to that elevation.
They carried immense symbolic weight. Stone symbolized permanence and connection to the earth. Gold leaves symbolize the divine or the precious nature of the ideals enshrined within. The thought, the time, the artistry invested ensured that the resulting environment wasn't just functional, but profoundly sacred and long-lasting.
So the core counter-argument to modernism is that beauty isn't a frill or a subjective indulgence. It's a necessary function for human-centered design.
That is precisely the claim that the emerging science is confirming. Beauty is a vital function. Our sources connect the presence of beauty directly to physiological health and pleasure. When we perceive something we find beautiful, a piece of art, a complex facade, a natural vista, our brains release happy hormones like oxytocin and endorphins.
So an aesthetically pleasing environment actively fights stress and depression.
It does. Living, working, or even just walking through a beautifully constructed city can directly improve the mental well-being of its inhabitants by providing continuous low-level aesthetic pleasure. It moves the environment from being a stressor to being a restorative force.
Where does this deep, inherent preference for certain visual features come from?
There's a strong evolutionary basis suggested for this. Our subconscious brains are continually scanning the environment for cues of safety and support. They recognize features like symmetry, rhythm, and proportion, things that are similar to the natural environments that aided ancestral survival.
So beauty signals safety.
When we encounter these characteristics, they provide an innate subconscious sense of security and pleasure. We're inherently attracted toward aesthetically beautiful things because, at a deep level, they signal order, health, and a habitable environment.
That's incredible. If beauty is related to survival, then the facade, the face of the building, must be incredibly important to our subconscious interaction.
It's utterly critical. Facades are the primary interface. They're essential for initial recognition and emotional response. Neuroscientists note that a large percentage of a newborn's neural organization is dedicated to facial recognition. It's a foundational survival strategy.
Our brains are face-finding machines.
Exactly. And this inherent human wiring influenced historical architectural patterns. For example, the popularity of certain proportional systems, like the 9-square pattern, is linked to its subconscious likeness to the human facial shape. It provides an immediate, relatable point of contact. A building's facade gives it a face, and our brains are wired to appreciate the aesthetic qualities of that face.
Let's discuss proportion and harmony, because these principles define classical architecture and were explicitly based on the human body, weren't they?
They were the bedrock of pre-modern architecture. The timeless appeal of classical design stems directly from its basis in nature and the human body. Ancient systems, dating back to Vitruvius in Roman antiquity, systematically studied the proportions of the human body to derive ideal ratios for building.
And then Da Vinci perfected that with the Vitruvian Man.
Exactly. That was later dramatically expounded upon by Renaissance thinkers, most famously by Leonardo da Vinci with his Vitruvian Man illustration, which links geometry, mathematics, and the human form.
And this mathematical harmony is echoed in the use of the golden ratio.
The golden ratio, or phi, approximately 1.618, is found abundantly in nature, geometry, and the structure of the human body.
It's everywhere.
From spirals of seashells to the ratios in our bone structure. It suggested that this proportion is inherent and deeply influences our minds, explaining why architecture based on these ratios, like the Parthenon, resonates with us on a fundamental, pleasing level.
Even the modernists couldn't escape it.
Even those early modernists who rejected ornament couldn't entirely escape this gravitational pull. Le Corbusier, for instance, spent decades developing his modular man system. a proportional grid based explicitly on the golden ratio and the height of a standing man. He still sought proportional elegance, even if he dismissed the storytelling elements.
The classical orders, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, also provide fantastic, tangible examples of how ornamentation and proportion conveyed narrative and dignity.
They were the architectural language. They show exactly how meaning was embedded in every structural element. Take the Corinthian order, famous for its elaborate capital based on the acanthus leaf. This isn't just a pretty plant. The story, as recounted by Vitruvius, is poignant and narrative-driven.
Tell us the story.
Well, the legend goes that a young maiden from Corinth passed away. Her nurse gathered a few of her beloved possessions, placed them in a basket, and set it upon the girl's grave, covering it with a tile to protect them.
Okay.
The basket was inadvertently placed over an acanthus root. When the acanthus grew, its leaves curled up around the sides of the basket, meeting the corner of the tile above. A sculptor named Callimachus saw this arrangement and was so moved by this accidental monument that he drew it, creating the prototype for the Corinthian capital.
Wow. So every Corinthian column is telling a story of remembrance, dignity, and regeneration.
Exactly. The ornamentation wasn't random. It conveyed cultural memory and dignity derived from a narrative that everyone understood. So when you apply that principle to a civic building, the message becomes monumentally powerful.
Like the Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court building, with its splendid use of the Corinthian order, conveys unparalleled dignity and the gravity of justice. The New York Stock Exchange, with its Corinthian columns, signifies that investments are secured and properly managed. Properly applied, the orders make buildings speak eloquently with soul, conveying the very essence of the institution they house.
Whereas modern glass boxes, by contrast, convey only the essence of a balance sheet. So we've established that the Glass Age prioritized capital, utility, and spectacle over soul, cultural memory, and psychological well-being. But this can't just be a critique of the past century. We need to find a way forward, a path of reclamation.
The growing movement today, championed by architects, psychologists, and cultural critics, is precisely about restoring soul and meaning to design. And it's not necessarily a demand for pure historical pastiche.
Right, not just making everything look old again.
No, but a clear demand for architecture that remembers its primary task, to shelter not just bodies, but souls. It needs to be reverent.
How does that translate into the practice of design? How do you blend the technological necessity of modern efficiency with that desired emotional depth?
The solution lies in a hybrid design model that fundamentally honors human creativity and craftsmanship alongside technological progress. We are seeing architects combine powerful digital tools like CAD and BIM, which manage complex structures, with human artistry and fabrication.
So you use the technology for the heavy lifting.
You use technology for efficiency, but you reserve the decisions about texture, proportion, and ornament for human artists and craftspeople.
That means we don't discard the technology, but we fundamentally reintroduce the human touch into the finishing.
Precisely. We see this in the resurgence of custom masonry and decorative joinery. For instance, using CNC milling machines for the initial rough cuts of complex ornamentation, but then relying on hand finishing to give the material depth and soul.
It gives it character.
It gives the building identity and tactile warmth that mass-produced concrete and steel inherently lack. Craftsmanship, historically, tells a story of human labor, passion, and local tradition. Mass-produced, uniform materials just feel generic and anonymous.
This issue also applies critically to the layout of our cities. Our sources suggest the modern North American urban model, with its isolated buildings and high-rise densification, has failed to create truly livable, human-centered cities.
The North American model, often based on zoning laws that mandate isolated buildings set back from the road, a pattern that later became formalized in suburbia, has systematically destroyed the public space of interaction.
There's no connection at street level.
Very little. The resultant densification often involves repetitive high-rise buildings separated by parking lots or sterile lawns, minimizing meaningful connection. This has resulted in a critical social and civic failure, the loss of the street as a continuous, engaging environment.
Which our sources call the bloodline of urban civilization.
The street is where social capital is built. Cities need continuous, human-scaled activity, public squares, and shared courtyards to foster spontaneous social interaction and civic engagement. The psychological message of relentless vertical development today often feels like the individual is irrelevant and interchangeable, just swallowed by the magnitude of the system.
Are there any emerging alternatives attempting to reverse this monolithic, sterile trend successfully?
Yes, one approach gaining traction globally is often referenced as the London vernacular. This style attempts to reconnect with local context and mitigate modernism's sterility by using traditional materials, particularly locally sourced brick, and maintaining human-scaled proportions that reference London's historical housing stock.
That sounds like a safe middle ground option, but is there a risk of just replacing one standardized look with a new, equally standardized one?
That is the inherent warning and the sharpest critique of this emerging style. Critics suggest that while the London vernacular successfully mitigates modernism's coldness through texture and materiality, it often remains tethered to the same rectilinear forms and standardized heights.
So it's still a box, just a brick box.
It risks creating a new form of monotony, a softened version of modernism's geometric tyranny. We must avoid replacing cold glass abstraction with merely predictable, comforting banality. True progress has to embrace complexity and unique identity.
So if we synthesize all this, what are the final overarching recommendations for architecture to restore meaning and spirit? What should we as citizens be demanding from our environment?
Well, to restore meaning and spirit, design must proactively integrate elements that modernism deliberately rejected. First and foremost, reintegrating ornament, proportion, and human craft is essential because these are the carriers of cultural depth and human identity. And second, we have to shift the design focus away from speed and spectacle. We must actively design for silence, for slowness, and for sanctuary. The purpose must be to serve the soul, not just the system.
We have covered such immense ground today, from the radical ideological break of the machine age to the empirical findings of how light and color fundamentally alter our brain chemistry. The evidence is overwhelming. Our surroundings are not passive backgrounds.
Not at all.
They are active, potent participants in our psychological state and our collective cultural memory. We must stop settling for buildings that merely house us. We have to demand architecture that moves us, that tells us who we are.
And if we connect this all to the wider cultural picture, architecture is perhaps the most honest, permanent reflection of a society's deepest values. Traditional buildings were often designed explicitly to elevate the human experience, using scale, beauty, narrative to inspire awe and foster community.
Right.
Modern architecture, in its most sterile, glass-dominated forms, often reduces the human experience to mere function, efficiency, and consumption. It signals that the only things that truly matter are speed and the balance sheet.
This raises an important question. If, as some of our sources suggest, contemporary architecture often defaults to what is contrived, abstract, or even deliberately ugly, intended to shock and prioritize spectacle over inherent human needs for beauty, what does that choice ultimately reveal about the values we, as a civilization in the Glass Age, hold most sacred? What are we reflecting when our buildings reflect nothing but capital and the fleeting nature of profit? And perhaps more chillingly, what is that lack of reflection doing to the souls we expect them to shelter?